Hey Rebels, my name is Matthew Barton. Welcome to the Rebellion Brewing Podcast. As you well know, beer's roots run deep in our agricultural-based community, and there's one issue I just can't shake that has me deeply concerned about the future of craft beer, and that's the impact of climate change. Today I'm sitting down with Emily Eaton, a professor of geography and environmental studies at the University of Regina. She's published a series of articles about climate change issues, and as I read them, I can't help but wonder what's going to happen to beer if we fail to act. So let's get into it. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me today. It's nice to be here.
For those who don't know you personally, who are you and what do you do?
I am, well, you already read, I'm a prof at the University of Regina, and I grew up in Saskatoon. I did all my graduate work in Ontario, and I came back to Saskatchewan in 2009 when I got a job at the University of Regina. So my early research was about agriculture and the movement against genetically modified wheat on the prairies. And when I returned to Regina in 2009, the province was in the middle of an oil boom. And I was told that, the university already had a lot of people studying agriculture, and so I should look to study something else. And because we were in an oil boom, I became really interested in Saskatchewan's oil economy. And a lot of those oil wells are on farmers and ranchers' land. So I did sort of continued some work with farmers and ranchers around oil extraction. And then my research sort of shifted more towards climate change and the possibilities of transitioning off of fossil fuels and how to do that in just ways.
In just ways? What does that mean?
Ways that are just, yeah. So that can look like many different things, but we know that a lot of the resistance to climate change policy in Saskatchewan is because so many of our communities are dependent on fossil fuel production. And so part of moving away from that in ways that are fair and treat people well is thinking about, what do we do with workers in that sector? How can we support them in a transition? What about communities that are particularly dependent on fossil fuels? How can we support them and create different opportunities? In those communities, right, there's lots of jobs that aren't in the oil industry itself, but that are kept alive because of oil and gas production. So thinking as well about workers in the service economy and other adjacent industries as well. So yeah, that's kind of, I could say a lot more about that, but it's not really the topic of the podcast today.
Well, in a way, I think it is, because I think getting people to wrap their heads around your work and around these issues is integral to helping save craft beer. I kind of feel like saving oil and gas jobs and the I Heart Oil and Gas stickers, that kind of stuff is used as a cudgel to silence critics and shut down debate and shut down people who are solution oriented. And one of the things that I keep circling around is how do we address their concerns and answer, provide them with solutions instead of just saying, well, it's just oil and gas forever until we die.
Right. Yeah, these are the big questions that I've been grappling with too. And so I'll just start by saying that, I did spend quite a bit of time several years ago now in oil producing communities. And there are lots of people in those communities who have very significant grievances with the industry. So if you are a farmer or a rancher with an oil well on your land, and it is bringing noxious weeds, it is spilling salinated water, it is spewing H2S, any of those things are hazards for rural people. I talked to a lot of workers who had a 5-year plan when they entered the oil industry. They wanted to make a lot of money in the service of something else, right? They wanted to buy a house, or they wanted to move back somewhere else, or they had this sort of plan to get in, make a lot of money and get out, and they kind of got stuck. And so when I talk to a lot of people in these oil and gas producing communities, they will recognize and expound upon all of the grievances that they have with the industry, but it's always in the context of like this broader support for the industry. So a conversation might start something like, I'm not anti-oil. Our community wouldn't be here without oil, but, and then what comes after the but, which is a list of grievances, might last for the next hour and a half. And so I'm really interested in this sort of conundrum where there are people who are deeply affected by the downturns, for example, in oil production. We saw since 2014, the oil patch has been laying off workers just like mad, both in Alberta and in Saskatchewan. And so people have a lot of grievances, but they also don't see an alternative. And they also feel deeply threatened by people that they might perceive as sort of urban environmentalists, liberals, Justin Trudeau from central Canada, sort of imposing the end of their livelihoods. And so I'm very much interested in how we get around that problem. And I think some of the things that we've seen recently with the truck convoy, and just a general rise of populist politics and Western alienation has that problem at the root of it. And if we aren't putting forward alternatives and solutions that actually make sense, so solutions that are based on the real local circumstances of particular communities, then we're really failing to sort of fill a gap in there for people. And I think people are prone to becoming swept up in these types of movements. And I guess the last thing I'll say on that is there's a reason that these common refrains continue. So you've identified some of them, like you're a hypocrite if you criticize oil and gas because you too heat your house with natural gas, or you too drive a car, right? Like those are some of the sort of gotcha moments of this script. And that script, there's many other parts to it, but has been a concerted effort by the oil and gas industry and their lobby groups and their public relations campaigns. They have circulated these messages. They've put a lot of resources into finding workers who become ambassadors for their industry. They circulate these things through these sort of AstroTurf groups like Canada's Energy Citizens, and that are active on Facebook, et cetera, and that have probably, I suspect, quite a lot of links and overlap with things like the convoy. And I shouldn't say the trucker convoy, because it turns out that most of the people involved in that convoy weren't truckers.
Right. I have family who are in the trucking industry. They're all vaccinated, and they're like, what the hell? Like, that ain't us. Yeah. Come on now.
Yeah, I read a cool tweet about it when at the height of the occupation in Ottawa, from someone who said, look, my dad's in the trucking industry, and I can tell you that truckers are like very brown, very vaccinated, and very much against this convoy.
You said so many interesting things I want to unpack there. Like that psychology piece of addressing people's concerns. But then I circle back to, you talk about the salination of the land and spraying salt water on the land makes it unusable for agriculture. That sounds pretty dumb. And H2S literally kills people. Like, what is, when they get exposed to it, it turns their skin pink, doesn't it, and suffocate them? And like, it's
Well, yeah, you could, if you get it in too high of concentrations, you can be killed pretty quickly. From H2S. But yeah, you can be knocked unconscious. You can have sort of long-term health impacts from lower levels of exposure too. I think a lot is not really known about the full spectrum of impacts from that gas, but there is some good reporting that was done a few years ago, investigative reporting that was done in Saskatchewan on H2S leaks and poisoning. And we know that, a lot of this goes unreported and unmonitored because the regulation of oil and gas in Saskatchewan is pretty much a situation of self-regulation for industry. So the government takes a pretty hands-off approach. But the salt water mostly comes from spills. So when you produce oil, you also find salinated water, and you have to produce the water as well. And then it becomes a big problem of how to get rid of all of that water that you're producing. It depends on the formation, but some formations are really heavy. For every barrel that you extract, up to 90% might be salinated water, and then you have to get rid of it, handle it. And there's always human error or equipment error, other things that happen when you're disposing of that large amount of water. And yeah, that severely impacts farmers' fields. Sometimes there'll be a leak underground that goes undetected for a long time, and that can cause a lot of damage to crops.
not great for farmers. Not great for our food supply if you're damaging the ground.
That's right. I'm just reading a really interesting book, actually, if people want to know more about that. It's mostly Alberta-based, but it's called The Hidden Scourge. And it takes a really thorough look at spills and leaks in the oil industry in Alberta, and the effects of some of these spills many years out on vegetation. And it's just so much worse than we would have ever known because, again, the regulators don't keep the data. There's spills that aren't ever reported. The amounts that are reported are way less than what actually spilt. They're just guesstimates in most cases anyways. It's just the industry is sort of chronically spilling and leaking. But it goes on with very little notice from people, except if they're on the land. And increasingly, we have fewer and fewer farmers who are actually on the land, right? We have more and more absentee landowners, larger farms, bigger equipment, and people have less of that relationship than in decades previous.
One of the things that strikes me, the things you're saying remind me a little bit of Upton Sinclair. I remember reading about his meat packing plant study and worker exploitation. And when you said we live in a society and it's like, haha, you're a hypocrite, you drive a car. It's like, how dare you try to live in the society that and change it for the better? And I think, well, Upton Sinclair and those guys did it with the meat packing industry. Why can't we do it with energy?
Mm-hmm. People often mobilize the example of enslavement. So, we would think it was ridiculous to say that, you can't, criticize slavery if you exist in a world at the time, if you existed in a world where slavery was a thing, right? How have we ever overcome any injustice historically? It is precisely by working within the world in which we find ourselves, right?
I just, it bothers me to no end. But then I think about stuff that I was covering in the news as a journalist 15 years ago, like carbon capture. I remember when the UofR was making their announcements with HTC Pure Energy, and they were out there saying this is the future and this is going to be so great and we're going to pull so much carbon out of the air, and then we're going to shove it back into the ground, and it will never leak, or it probably won't leak, and we're going to get more oil. And it feels like it's been almost 2 decades since those announcements were made, and carbon capture seems to be kind of, now correct me if I'm wrong, I saw a big study sheet of all these places in the United States and around the world, and they've just abandoned it. And then I look here, and they're like, we're doubling down on carbon capture. And I'm like, what's the disconnect? What's going on?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because the federal government has decided to double down on it too. And so there are all sorts of different reports that have forecasting and scenarios for reaching net zero. And some of them do involve, what we probably do need to, because we haven't addressed climate change and greenhouse gas emissions earlier, 30 years ago, when we should have been starting and we knew about the problem. We're at the point now where we do need to draw carbon out of the atmosphere in order to rescue a habitable world. And so there are some methods of doing that. And, some of them include, natural sequestration from forests or healthy grasslands or wetlands. Some research from the UofR is showing the sequestration value of wetlands. Prairie grasses have really long roots that sequester carbon as well. So we can use natural methods, but we're getting to the point now where things are getting so dire that we probably do need to take as much carbon as possible out of the air. And so there is a technology called direct air capture that proposes to do just that. It's in its infancy. But for the most part, our CCS, our carbon capture and sequestration projects have mostly been on coal and oil and gas. So in Saskatchewan, we have Boundary Dam 3 on a coal-fired plant that we were promised when SaskPower started to build it, that it would be able to capture at 90% of its total emissions. And in no single year since it has been in production for over 7 years now, has it captured 90% of what it emits. In most years, it's capturing more like 40%, some years even less than 40%. And the SaskPower recently told me in an email that they don't even try to get to 90 anymore because the oil industry only wants to buy 65% of what they could capture. And why would the oil industry buy sequestered or captured carbon? Because they can use it in aging oil fields like the Weyburn unit, where Boundary Dam 3's carbon is piped to. And they use it as a sort of flood. So they push it underground, and it's supposed to sort of pressurize and sweep out some oil that would otherwise be unreachable. So that field is considered with conventional techniques to be exhausted. But if we add this carbon dioxide, we can push more oil out of it. And so the critique of carbon capture is not necessarily that like it's an evil technology. I would say, it's unproven at scale. Like you said, most jurisdictions have abandoned it because it's very expensive. It should never be used for enhanced oil recovery. And I was happy to see that the federal government's investment tax credit for CCUS excludes enhanced oil recovery.
That's where they're taking the carbon, like a liquid version of it. Correct me if I'm wrong. They shove it underground. It loosens up the oil that's still in the formation, and then they pump it out. You're saying?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I just described. Okay. Yeah.
I'm just dumb it down for me. You got to be even dumber.
Even dumber. Okay. And so they've excluded that, but they haven't excluded the oil industry itself. So they're basically saying, there was a carbon capture facility in the tar sands that there was a Global Witness report on recently, maybe last month or the month before, that showed that plant was actually releasing more greenhouse gas emissions than it was sequestering. And so there's this idea, sort of what the federal government has settled on is this idea that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the oil industry, and carbon capture can be part of the solution. And the reason that I and 400 of my colleagues across Canada, in universities across Canada, we spearheaded this letter opposing this tax credit. The reason that we're against that approach is because we know from many reports that have been released in the last few years, especially starting with one in 2018 from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. We know that we need to phase out fossil fuels to keep warming under 2 degrees. I was going to say to keep warming to 1.5 degrees, but the latest report just last week suggested that like we have almost no hope now left of keeping warming to 1.5 degrees. But if we want to keep it to under 2, we need to phase out fossil fuels across the world. And that's because fossil fuels account for about 85% of total greenhouse gas emissions. And so we need to get to net zero by 2050 globally.
That's where we're producing only as much as like the Earth and our technology can pull out of the atmosphere.
That's right. So we need to get to zero by 2050. And the only way to do that, to get to zero, is actually to phase out fossil fuels, because we can produce them in Saskatchewan using carbon capture. And like we can reduce the emissions or even maybe get to net zero in the production of the oil and gas by using things like carbon capture. But somewhere that oil and gas is going to be burned. It's going to be burned in a combustion engine, a car or a truck or whatever, or it's going to be burned in as a fuel for home heating in the form of natural gas, etc. And burning that actually accounts for like most of the GHGs associated with the product. So we're really upset that I guess that the federal government has decided that they're going to ignore the whole part of the equation that is downstream and where the majority of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from. Why would we invest in a very expensive network of pipelines and technology that is going to prop up an industry that we know we need to phase out? And so by putting those investments into an industry that needs to be phased out, we're sort of prolonging the life of that industry, because now we're making future production cheaper because we've built out this infrastructure, right? So it becomes like harder to switch off of oil and gas as we're building out new infrastructure to make it less greenhouse gas intensive.
I'm going to ask you a really stupid question. If we stop with the oil and gas, like in theory, if we stopped with that, how do people get to work? How do they heat their homes? How do we maintain a relative similar lifestyle to what we kind of understand now?
Really great questions. So the first thing to recognize is that when we say we need to phase out fossil fuels, it does mean that today's production is the peak, but it doesn't mean you turn off the tap tomorrow, right? And so it will be like, ideally, if we actually do it correctly, it will be a managed phase out. And then we can come back to some of those things that I said earlier about justice associated with like actually managing a phase out and a wind down in ways that are good for people and economies. But we know we also have the technologies that we need. The good news is, in some ways, that making this transition is going to actually necessitate a huge amount of labor and work. And so Regina just passed a couple weeks ago its municipal energy and sustainability framework, which has a goal of net zero again by 2050. And some of the things that we know we need to do right here in Regina are, number one, retrofit all of our buildings. to make them energy efficient. Once we have retrofitted all of our buildings to make them super insulated, to have a airtight envelope, then we can transition away from natural gas towards heat pumps and electrical backup, because with really good insulation, we actually don't need as much heat, right? And so, on days when, and our houses and our buildings will keep heat and be more energy efficient. So that's one thing. That's a huge amount of work and construction, right, involved in that. We know that we need to we need to electrify transportation. So yes, EVs, but also buses, public transportation systems need to be electrified. We need to probably make our transportation systems better so that more people will be able to make the choice to take either active transportation or public transportation to work or out on the weekend. If you had a bus going to Rebellion Brewery, it would be really good, I think, for the business and also for driving under the influence, that kind of thing. So there's transportation. We need to electrify that. We also need to make the sources of our electricity green. So in Saskatchewan, we're relying quite a bit on coal. The federal government will phase out coal through regulation, so that is coming. But we also still have natural gas-fired power plants. Those will need to be transitioned. We need to build out solar and wind. We probably need a permanent connection with Manitoba for access to some of their hydro, because that's a source of electricity that is less intermittent than solar or wind. In other words, it's available under most conditions. It's less variable. So those are some things we need to do. And once we have done that, I think the big question is, like, in this field that I'm in, some people have made the argument that, for example, people in the global north, and specifically rich people, their greenhouse gas footprint is very significantly larger than other people's. So there are like equity and justice considerations here. But in general, right, there are lots of people in the global north as well who are living right now in what we might call energy poverty, whose homes are too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter, and who can't afford to pay their energy bills. They're skimping on food or something else in order to do that. So if we could invest in, really energy efficient rental housing, or better yet, public social housing, we could bring people's bills down in that way. And we should be directing investment into communities that whose living standard is currently, not below average, let's say.
You talked about Manitoba Hydro, and my understanding is hydro takes too long to develop in time to meet the time frame. Like 2050 is too soon for us to build out hydro capacity here. Could we not? Like, we got big rivers.
Yeah, the hydro resource isn't as good in Saskatchewan, as my understanding, as Manitoba. There are also, like, another really big interest of mine is in Indigenous rights and sovereignty. And there are significant issues with large-scale hydro projects, and we recently saw the one in Labrador, which was very much Muskrat Falls. It was very much opposed by Innu people. And actually the first environmental assessment that ever happened in Saskatchewan was started as it was struck as a board of inquiry because Saskatchewan didn't have environmental assessment legislation yet in the 1970s. And it was a study of a SaskPower proposed hydro project on the Churchill River. And the board went out along the whole river. They they consulted with and talked to all of the communities along the river. It's a really interesting final report that they published, where they said that, this river is the heritage of northern peoples, that it is the source of their livelihood in the past and the source of their prosperity for the future. I'm paraphrasing now, these aren't the exact words, but for these reasons, we've decided against, imperiling the Churchill system by developing this Windigo project. And so one thing we have to remember with hydro too is it does flood, and Manitoba Hydro's had a lot of grievances and a lot of resistance because of this, but it does flood territories. And it has been done through, state agencies and crown corporations without a lot of consideration for Indigenous rights and sovereignty. So there's that issue with it too. But we're also talking now about small modular nuclear reactors in Saskatchewan. And it's my understanding that one doesn't yet exist in real life. And so it would be a surprise to me to hear that we could build out SMR, small modular nuclear reactors, faster than new hydro, since we know how to do it. But again, with the caution of Saskatchewan might not have the best resource, and we might not want to do it because of respecting Indigenous sovereignty and rights.
That's for hydro, not for nuclear.
For hydro. For nuclear, there's a whole long other debate around nuclear, and we've had it for a long time in this province. There's been a strong anti-nuclear movement, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, I think.
Literally, I'm reading your studies online. I was looking through the PDFs and all that stuff, and then a couple days ago, I saw that Stanford had announced they've developed solar panels that work at night, which can help produce a base load of energy even when there's no sunlight. And I just sat there thinking, there we go. Let's just do this. Let's just do it now. Thanks, science. Why can't we move faster on solar is kind of my question. Why are we focusing on carbon capture and nuclear, and solar kind of seems to make sense to me? Maybe I'm missing something.
Well, entrenched interests and power, right? And so, I'm part of this project called Mapping the Power of the Carbon Extractive Corporate Resource Sector in Western Canada, which is a mouthful. We call it the Corporate Mapping Project. And what we've been really interested in is finding out how the oil and gas industry, or the fossil fuel industry, exerts its influence and shapes, decision making and everyday life all over Western Canada. And so, a few months ago, a city councillor in Regina decided that when a motion came before council about a sponsorship policy, he thought, well, we're just about to, embark on this 100% renewable transition. This would be a good time to use that lens and suggest maybe we shouldn't allow fossil fuel corporations to be named sponsors on our buildings, because this communicates something about our values and our partnerships. And the fossil fuel industry came after him hard. He lost his job from a local firm in town. He's a lawyer. And we know that, these corporations have strong lobbying arms. They make many contacts with politicians in provincial and federal governments. They have, as I already said earlier in the podcast, they've mobilized these sort of social media campaigns, these sort of grassroots initiatives to mobilize people around their messaging. So all of this is very powerful. In other words, it's really hard to make governments do the right thing. And I would just add that in this province, We don't have an effective opposition on climate change either. We don't have a party in the legislature that is taking climate change seriously, that is putting forward ideas and visions and plans for how to do this transition in ways that are appealing to people. They have decided to keep their mouths shut about the issue, probably for fear of this type of retaliation. So I think the reasons are complex why we can't just do it, but all of the reports now are saying, like, we have all the technological solutions. It's political will that is keeping us back. And we do need to figure out a way to overcome that. And part of that is, political will, but part of it is also having leaders in the community that can help shift people's ideas about this, right? Because a lot of people do believe that we can't survive without fossil fuels, or that we'll have to turn the clocks back, and live in some sort of, abject misery.
Is it feasible to transition fossil fuel workers over to renewable energy sectors? Is that even possible? Like, is there a correlation of skills and abilities?
There's lots of smart people looking at this. So a lot of the trade professions exist both within the fossil fuel industries and other industries. So if you're an electrician, you can work on any site. But I think there has also been a lot of focus on moving fossil fuel workers into renewable energy. And I don't think that there's necessarily, like, if you talk to fossil fuel workers and you talk about a transition, if they're willing to go there, they don't necessarily want to switch over to renewable energy. They might want to become a teacher, or they might want to retrain and do any number of things, become an artist or something else as well. So, but there are certainly, like when I talked about building out, we need to wind down fossil fuels, but we need to wind up a whole bunch of things. The building trades, because of energy efficient building and energy retrofits. We do need a lot of electricians for switching over the electrical grid. People are interested in having things like solar panels on their houses, and like all of those jobs, many of them are in the sort of skilled trades, and the skilled trades will do well in the transition. I think one of the things that has been underplayed maybe is, a lot of those skilled trades are quite male dominated fields. And when we talk about low carbon work, we should also be talking about things like teaching and nursing and medicine and elder care and all of those things that are more so in the caring professions, and that are more feminized work, but also the ways in which people in fossil fuel communities, especially if they're women, tend to be segregated into sort of lower paying service sector work. And we need to support those workers as well in a transition, because they're actually very vulnerable, because they're making less and in more precarious types of employment to begin with. So it's complex, but it is possible to have, Alberta did it with their coal phase out. They had a just transition package available for coal workers, and it involved things like a retraining allowance, a bridge to retirement for older coal workers, an EI top up so that your EI would last longer and be a bigger benefit than the one that the federal government offers. Money for relocation if you had to move, training allowances that could be vouchers that any university or post-secondary, not just university, but any post-secondary or training college in Alberta would accept, things like that. So there is a suite of sort of labor market adjustment policies that we can look at too, specifically for fossil fuel workers.
Why aren't we talking about this publicly? Why is it? I haven't heard about any of this stuff.
I know. Well, like I said, we haven't had the courage, I think, in Saskatchewan to actually say it out loud yet, that the energy transition is happening, whether we like it or not. And, Saskatchewan's going to be passed over for all sorts of green investment in the future if we don't come to this conversation willingly and make changes to our economy. The federal government is rolling out all sorts of programs. There's money on the table. But our provincial government just the other day, I read a news article from the PA, one of the PA publications, that quoted him as saying, some people come to me and they say Saskatchewan has the highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita in the whole country, which is true. And Mo said, I don't care. So that's not the kind of attitude that is going to lead to talking about these things and planning for a future, so that the energy transition doesn't just leave us high and dry either, because there are global market forces that are happening. And, Europe's developing a carbon tariff. Mo talks about how he's so proud of increasing our trade with Europe. Well, they're not going to want a lot of our goods if we aren't reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, for example. So, there's many reasons for Saskatchewan to be interested in this and not sticking our heads in the sand, but we don't have any political leadership that is willing to lead on this.
I mean, selfishly, I don't want to mess up barley. I don't want to mess up wheat. I want us to be able to continue to grow the crops we grow. If our farmers can't grow them, it doesn't matter if they're the best in the world. If the land is parched and the seasons are messed up, we can't keep brewing beer. And suddenly we're no longer the ass-kicking-est province making beer. We're a bunch of schmucks with crispy fields. Don't mess with the beer, man.
Oh, right. I forgot it's a podcast about beer. Yes, agriculture is going to be severely affected both by the effects of climate change, but also in this energy transition, it's a really big conundrum. How do we decarbonize agriculture? Because agriculture is a big source of our greenhouse gas emissions as well.
One of the nice things that I've kind of found over the last couple of years of talking to farmers is these guys are not dummies. They're looking at global markets. They're thinking years ahead, whether it's soil management or inputs, fuel. They want to save money by not blowing their entire nest egg on putting a tractor in the field and then fueling it up, or running their combine on fuel. It's so expensive. They see these things. They're excited for some kind of solution. And I see a lot of the younger guys, maybe around my age, plus or minus 5 years, who are really thinking about how to make their business, their farm business, sustainable. And I really feel for these guys, and I want to give them a voice, because as much as we are jealous about beer, I want to see them succeed too. And suddenly I feel like the conversation becomes less about, just one small sliver of the economy and all these knock-on effects, all these other people. That's kind of where my mind goes.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. There's a farmer in Saskatchewan named Darren Qualman, and I encourage folks who are interested in climate change and agriculture to check out his work. He works for the National Farmers Union as well, and he's written some really good reports about decarbonizing agriculture. And he has made the argument that, if we think back around, I can't remember, sometime mid-century, if you look at a graph of tractors versus horse-drawn forms of farm implements, I guess, they cross around mid-century. In other words, there were almost no fossil fuels on farms until about 1918. And then, you have a rapid rise in tractors at the same time as you have a sort of phasing out of draft animals. And he uses tractors just as the proxy for a whole bunch of other sort of fossil fuels in agriculture. But we didn't really have chemical fertilizers before that era either. And in a short while, we've now come to the point where we're basically, taking fossil fuels through things like chemical fertilizer, which is basically just natural gas.
The Haber process, right?
Yeah, Haber-Bosch process.
Haber-Bosch, there you go.
Yeah. Or Haber, I'm not sure. And turning it into chemical nitrogen. So we're really just taking like fossil fuels in one form or another and turning them into food basically now, right? But yet not a long time ago on the prairies, we had a form of agriculture that was low input, that used natural fertilizers, that was also lower output. We have to recognize that as well. But there are things that we can learn about through that process, right? We need to return to, figuring out ways that we can have non-fossil fuel inputs, ways that we can intercrop species to help with weed control and other things, right? So I'm always amazed at the ingenuity of farmers figuring things out in their fields too, and especially those who are really committed to finding a different way forward that is consistent with a habitable planet. And beer.
I've had Lana Shaw on the podcast a couple times. She studies intercropping, specifically with like peas and legumes, and she was saying really big crops paired with little small crops to see how they would do because they're easier to sort. But she's like on the cutting edge of this research, and she's also really passionate about craft beer, so it's a great fit. I think you'd get along with her.
That sounds great. I'll look her up.
I guess as a final takeaway, who's doing it right? Who can we look to as a jurisdiction? Because you just mentioned Alberta's doing some really cool stuff to help workers, and I hadn't even heard about that. So who's doing a good thing here? Who can we look to?
Well, I think, you can look at the Alberta coal transition. I'm not suggesting that everything was perfect there. One thing is the Alberta government gave a lot of money to the companies themselves, and they actually accelerated the transition to gas even faster than the government thought. And so the process was really abrupt for workers. But on the area of just transition, there's some other jurisdictions that have done it well, like Spain, Germany, New Zealand. And it all starts with what we would call tripartite social dialogues. So getting the government, the employer, and the workers together to talk about what their future is and how they can transition well. So that's like on the area of just transition. I'll tell you one place that's not doing it well. We've been looking at the co-op refinery complex in Regina, and their messaging is all about the coming low carbon transition. They have an energy roadmap to 2040, and they didn't engage their workers at all in this, and they seem to be using it as cover for workforce reduction, layoffs, and union busting. So that union is very much, Local 594 of UofR is very much been, they feel anyways, abused by their employer, and their employer's trying to use the low carbon transition as their sort of public relations around treating workers poorly. But in terms of other just more broadly energy transition, there was a really interesting example. The Regina Energy Transition is a local group that meets and tries to advocate for the city to be aggressive and progressive with their energy transition. They brought in a speaker last week from the city of Ithaca, which has passed a resolution to become net zero by 2030. The timeline is very tight, and they are looking at all sorts of really interesting, innovative projects and ways of accomplishing this with justice, as a lens, so focusing also in communities that have been marginalized. So I would look for things coming out soon from the city of Ithaca. But yeah, there's all sorts of really interesting stuff happening all over the world now, I think. There depends what angle you want to take.
Well, I mean, my angle is always going to be beer. I feel like when you're trying to talk about these abstract things and you say, well, 1 degree, man, 2 degrees, like, what does even 2 degrees mean when it comes to climate change? And I think the average person is too abstract, but it's like you hold a beer in your hand and suddenly somebody walks up and slaps the beer out of your hand and says, no more beer for you. Then, oh shit, that's real. You know, like labor rights is a very politically charged topic for a lot of people here. They don't think about it the same way others do. I've been called simultaneously a communist and a fascist by the same person in the same conversation simply for asking questions and trying to understand a thing. I think about when I was in school and we were talking about how countries like Congo with diamonds and bauxite and coal and all these great resources, and it was like, why are these places beset by war and have weak governance and murder and all this awful stuff when they're so rich? And I see a lot of parallels here where we're resource rich and we have all these opportunities, and I feel like we've whiffed a bit. This is me on my soapbox. So my angle always comes back to the thing I can hold in my hand, which is that cold, refreshing glass of beer on a hot day. And if somebody says it's going to cost me $15 to $20 for a single pint, that makes me very unhappy. And I'm like, let's not get there. Let's solve this now so we can have beer when we're old. You know?
Amen.
That's my little rant. I'll get off my soapbox now. I don't have another question. I just wanted to say thank you for your time and thank you for sharing your perspective and some of this information. If somebody wants to learn more, where should they go?
Well, you can Google my name alongside the University of Regina, and you'll come to my faculty homepage, and there's lots of information there, including my email address and links to a website I have called Sask Oil and publications and reports and things like that. That's probably the best place.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. That was fun.
Rebels, thanks for listening today. If you have any questions or comments about this episode, be sure to join us on our brand new Facebook group page, the Rebellion Brewing Podcast. I'm also proud to let you know we're members of the Saskatchewan Podcast Network. It's a one-stop shop for tons of locally produced shows from across our province. You can find them at saskpodcastnetwork.com. I'm going to include links in the show notes so you can find more about Emily's work online. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Untappd so you don't miss out on the latest in Sask craft beer news. Thank you for joining the Rebellion.